The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. In our last video studying the Rite of Spring, I covered Stravinsky's creative collaborators and how the circumstances of their careers brought them all together for one epic work of art. Now let's switch gears with the perspective of a professional musician whose career has been shaped by frequent performances of the Rite of Spring, as a concert work and as a ballet. Okay, so today I've got Vermont Ilsan in the chair, and we are going to be talking about bassoon and the Rite of Spring and how those two things come together to create a really unique work, and also to get the player's perspective on this really significant work for the instrument. To start off with, Vermont, you are the principal bassoonist for Orchestra Wellington, and you also do something abroad.
Yes, my main job is in Chicago, and it's in Lyric Opera of Chicago. I'm in the section there, primarily second bassoon. I've been doing that for the past 12 years. Before that, I was principal bassoon in the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, and was doing that since 1993. And before that, I was over in the United States working in various orchestras there. So I'm back and forth between New Zealand and America all the time.
You have a kind of a long history of playing the Rite of Spring, which I guess, any principal bassoonist would naturally see it as part of the regular language of the instrument. And not just because of the opening solo. There's this wonderful Russianness about it, and the way that the bassoon solos are scored and some of the support that it gives to the winds.
Right. Well, as a bassoonist, it's one of those pieces which you learn as a student. Obviously, when you're learning your excerpts, it's one of the primary excerpts that you need to learn. And you always look forward to it coming up in the orchestra. And I must say it comes up regularly. I've played it many, many times in all of the orchestras I've been in. And I've mostly played the principal part, but I'm slowly working my way down through the section. There's 5 parts, and I've now played 3 of the 5. The 4th and 5th parts involve contrabassoon,
right.
And I'm not really a contra player, so I haven't quite gotten to those yet. I did have a chance earlier this year to play the 4th part, which doubles contra, but I chose to play the 3rd part instead. So I have played all 3 of the bassoon parts that don't double contra, and I've played the principal part many times, going back to when I was a student, and then in each orchestra I've been in, it comes up every few years. So it's a regular thing. And then a couple of years ago, I actually had the opportunity to do it in the pit for the Joffrey Ballet in Chicago. And I'll tell you about that because that was a great experience. But so I have actually done it accompanying the dancers, which is a whole different experience and a really great experience.
Right, because the tempos are a bit different than concert tempos.
Right, and unfortunately you can't actually see the dancers when you're down there in the pit, but you can hear them and stomping around up there and just knowing they're there. And for me it's quite special because I lived in Chicago up until 1993, and I attended the Joffrey Ballet's premiere of the restoration of Nijinsky's choreography. So that was kind of a big event. I think that was in 92 or 91, around there.
Right, the early 90s, definitely.
Early 90s. And I thought it was just thrilling to see the sets, the costumes, and that choreography, which is incredibly iconic and which was so controversial when it was first done. And for me, it was amazing. It was just superb. I thought it worked beautifully. And it was on a program with Afternoon of a Faun and Les Noces. So it had several of those ballets in the original choreography. I have to say, Les Noces was incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's got the thing with the hair,
Right.
the sort of the braids that, 50 feet long. So that was spectacular. And then to go full circle, whatever, 25 years later, and to be in the pit for the Joffrey Ballet reviving that same production was really exciting.
I have to say that when Joffrey came to San Francisco in the early 90s, there were a lot of heavyweights from San Francisco Symphony who had just made a specialty out of some of the different principal parts. And they all joined in, like Steve Paulson played principal bassoon for that opening solo. And apparently his teacher had said, look, take the opening solo from the Rite and play it in a way that I have never heard before. And his teacher had taught about 300 bassoonists, so that was a big challenge.
That is a really big challenge.
And it really did sound like some primitive instrument when he played it, like whatever a dudki sounds like maybe, or whatever the folk element perhaps. It had a quality to it that was unlike anything I've heard.
Well, this is the controversy and the discussion in the bassoon world, as small as the bassoon world is, and we're kind of geeky that way. We don't have a lot to talk about, so we have to talk about things like the Rite of Spring, is how to approach that solo. And I got to do a lot of work as a student with Saul Schoenbach, who was principal bassoon of the Philadelphia Orchestra, taught at Curtis Institute. I did not attend the Curtis Institute, but I spent, I think, 7 summers with him doing master classes and that sort of thing, Tanglewood and other places. So I got to be coached by him quite a lot. And of course, he's the bassoonist in Fantasia. And he obviously played it under Stravinsky a number of times and knew all of the bassoonists who worked under Stravinsky and played it for Stravinsky. So I got a lot of the stories about what did Stravinsky say in rehearsal, how did he want it to sound, etc. And the general feeling is that it should be primitive, it shouldn't be beautiful, it should be sort of otherworldly. People have talked about the idea of maybe the first plant in spring sort of breaking through the ice, the first shoot kind of coming up out of the ground, and that it's at the top of the bassoon register. It should be this sort of eerie kind of sound. But then you have a couple of other strains that come up against that. One is this dudki thing, which I've only heard about fairly recently from a few conductors. The idea, maybe you can say more about it, that Stravinsky had in mind this ancient Russian double reed instrument. I don't know what they sounded like, but perhaps it's a kind of a harsh sound. I had a conductor encouraging the winds to not play very quietly at all, kind of make a more raucous sort of sound.
For the introduction, you mean?
For the whole introduction.
Right.
Not to be beautiful and polished, and maybe to take the dynamics up a little bit higher than marked. What do you think
I would kind of agree with that. I think that there's a tendency to treat the Rite of Spring a bit like a very modernist work where everybody has to be incredibly polished and people are obsessing about balance and everything else. And then there is also a school of thought where you could think of almost like somebody looking back culturally in a bit of a clumsy way and saying, look at these primitive people, let's be really primitive about this. And to want to celebrate that sort of theoretical vision of the way things were in the past with, just much rougher textures and things fighting rather than blending. I have to say that as I've been picking apart the score, I've been noticing certain things that really do feel to me, not necessarily stereotypical, but seem playing around a little bit with cliches. Like, you'll have parallel fourths doing little gestures, which really remind me a bit of movie westerns. Whenever you see the Indians cross the prairie, you hear certain kinds of things that were thought to be sort of a way of being categorically primitive. So I think that primitivism is a very modern idea. But I think that it just depends on how the conductor wants to have everybody play it, whether they want to fight or whether they want everybody to sort of blend and merge very beautifully.
Well, one thing I would like to say about this, which comes down to how orchestral musicians and conductors interact, is that it's all well and good for a conductor to say, I don't want a beautiful sound, I want it to be harsh and maybe a little ugly, etc. But at the end of the day, when you give a performance, what you play, especially if you have a big solo, that's on you as a player. Nobody in the audience knows what happened in rehearsal.
Right.
If a conductor tells you to play with an ugly tone and you play that way, you know that for everyone in the audience, they think that you have an ugly tone.
Right.
They don't know that the conductor asked for that. The conductor is completely absolved of any responsibility during the performance. So you as a performer, nobody wants to play with an ugly tone. Everyone wants to sound as beautiful as possible. So there's a little bit of a tension there. It's not just Rite of Spring. This can happen in any piece of music. If you have a big exposed solo and the conductor demands a certain interpretation that goes against what you would prefer, there's a real tension there because you know that in doing that, the audience will assume that's your idea. Now, there's some famous examples of that. The thing that kind of springs to mind for me is Glenn Gould and Leonard Bernstein with that Brahms piano concerto performance where Bernstein got up and basically disowned the interpretation before the start of the concert because I guess Glenn Gould wanted a tempo that Bernstein didn't want.
Right.
Maybe it was far too slow. I think maybe it was a very slow tempo.
I think you're right. Yeah,
which is strange because Bernstein is known for his glacially slow tempos. But so he stood up and made a speech saying, "This is not my tempo. This is Glenn Gould's tempo. We're going to do it." But I kind of, washed my hands of the whole thing. Well, we as orchestral musicians never get that chance to make that speech. I've never had a conductor ask me to do anything differently with the Rite of Spring solo. I have had conductors demand other solos, like Shostakovich's Ninth Symphony has one of the biggest solos for bassoon. It's 2 cadenzas, which are really extended. And usually conductor will completely leave you to your own devices for that. But I did have the experience of a conductor, I will not name any names, who wanted it in a particular way, which for me was abominable. I couldn't stand playing it that way. But I had to do it because that's what he wanted. For me, it was very pedantic, dull, metronomic, etc. Right. That's what he wanted. That's what I had to do. But it was not a good feeling.
My entire interview with Praman is 45 minutes long, and I've uploaded it in full on Patreon for supporters to watch. For now, though, let's preview some of my analysis of the next section of the Rite of Spring, the Ritual of the Two Rival Tribes. Our study takes us to the next section of Part 1 of the Rite of Spring, the Ritual of the Two Rival Tribes, which is also known as the battle between the two cities, or the rivalry between the two cities. And it starts off with this huge lower brass and timpani solo section, and it's just really terrific. It's got trombones just really blasting away, with tuba playing an augmented fourth on F sharp in the middle, between these octave Cs. Interestingly, this big blast does not actually have any timpani underneath it. The timpani comes in right afterwards on beat 2 and. So basically the idea is that the piccolo timpani, the smaller kettles, are playing unison with the first tuba, and the timpani grande are playing a unison with the second trombone here. And it, just really is an amazing moment. If you really want to hear the power of the low brass, and especially bass trombone and tenor trombone playing together, it's just really a moment of hugeness. Now, having said that, what is the dominant instrument or group of instruments in this entire section, which I consider to be the Ritual of the Two Rival Tribes and the Procession of the Oldest and Wisest One, which is kind of it's just sort of like the coda to this part. It is really the horns. They just get this really powerful chorale, and sometimes accompanied by other instruments, like most typically the bassoons and contrabassoon, which continue this idea here, the C octave with the augmented fourth in the middle, right? You can see that here, where we've got the second and the third writing this F sharp, but the first bassoon on top and the two contrabassoons on the bottom. So, yeah, exact same pitches. It's just a wonderful moment here with the horns blasting away. And it's a very Russian idea. It reminds me a lot of moments in Petrushka. Yeah, and there's also support down here by the cellos and double basses. Now, interestingly, the cellos can play this octave here just as non-divisi, as a double stop, because the C is open, and the top C can be played on the G string quite easily. I would take this as a given that it was non-divisi, and the basses are writing the F sharp in the middle, right? Because this reads an octave higher than its pitch, which would be right here. So yeah, I really just love this, and it dovetails right from the end of the timpani and lower brass solo. And here you can really hear the differences in character between horns and lower brass. The lower brass just has more of a bite to it, including the tuba. I mean, the tuba is more closely related to the horn because it's it's more of a conical instrument, and it has a kind of a, not a duller sound, but it has a the partials that it favors are very similar to the partials that the horns favor. So the tuba can actually integrate into the horns just as easily as it can integrate into the lower heavy brass, the trombones and bass trumpets. This idea comes back over and over again in different developments. Here it's alternated with this really, really fun thing that is so dominated by these piercing notes here in the second and third trumpet and the trombones, right? Just like the power here is just immense. It's so huge that you just sort of hear this, the main idea, as a swirling background, which is just dominated by these huge noises. I mean, it makes me wonder whether or not Stravinsky realized just how powerful that would be there, because it's a fairly intricate texture. When you look at it, the oboes and English horns are doubling what's going on here in the strings, and also they're getting some support from the first trumpet, right? And they start with these huge triple stops. That is just really a wonderful idea all on its own, and it would be interesting to hear without these big dominating notes. Just these high G sharps, and then this low F sharp here. So very cool idea. And then you have these rushing downward phrases from the flutes and the alto flute, and the alto flute's playing fairly high here. That's a high D right there. So you just have this big swirl of these chords here, just basically triads for the flutes sounding up an octave, and then the alto flute is basically coming in underneath these triads. So such a really cool idea. Okay, so let's move on. And of course, we've got clarinets in there, and we've got trills by piccolo and sopranino clarinet, and just really gives it a lot of bite. Okay, this pretty much just happens 2 times in a row. Things going back and forth. Notice that there is a slight difference here between the first instance of these horns and bassoons bashing away. Basically, what Stravinsky does the second time is he just removes this first beat right in here, right, and then just takes it up from, picks it up from the written F sharp right here, right. So it's just kind of copying and pasting, which happens a lot in Stravinsky. You can see here on the next page that same downward swirling flutes and clarinets and the almost not audible motive here being played by the strings and the oboes and English horns just really, it just continues on, and trumpet. Now, that takes us to the next really interesting part, and that is this quarter note triplet in 3/2. Right, so you've got a bit of a glissando here. So Stravinsky is going to sort of assume a bit of a sort of ripping over the partials, ripping up to an A, And notice that this really does go, I'm going to really zoom in here. This does go over the spectrum of partials. This F is going to sound slightly out of tune if the player is just doing an uncontrolled rip, because if you are thinking that this is ripping over the partials that you would get from like an open F up to this A here, then this would be out of tune, right? And then the same thing is true here, right? If we're assuming that this is just that the horn is basically holding open the F tuning, then so then you would get this partial here of the G, and then the B flat, and then the eighth one is a C, and so on, just ripping up to this. So he's actually written out the rip just to give it no doubt that is kind of what he wants you to do. That doesn't mean that the player will actually follow this necessarily, but I mean it's just a kind of a guide as to do this, because it happens so quickly that there's almost no sense in overanalyzing it. And then we've got this this just really, really powerful chordal part, bum 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 bum, which is answered by that same bum 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 bum. It's just kind of nice, once again, call and response happening between sections and ideas. I like just the huge fatness of this. You got this second bass tuba just crawling down to this low B flat, and these horns are going at it. Now this is once again old notation, so this is going to be sounding up a fourth. So this is going to be two horns on B flat, an octave higher than the tuba, right? And then these are going to be sort of kind of doubling each other at the octave and kind of not, because you see that the tuning is a little bit different there, right? So this is an F third and this is an F sharp third, right? This is an E minor third and this is a E major third, right? So, but with this doubling on top, you should sort of hear, that's what kind of leads to the kind of dissonance of the chord, is that it's got imperfections in it as it goes down to this really, really cool harmony here, which also is underlined by this really, really fat note by the first and second bassoons, right? So once again, E being the augmented fourth of a B flat octave, right? So he's continuing on with that whole C octave with an F sharp in the middle. Yeah, and moving on, the horns come back in for another one of their little gestures, and I like this a lot. The approach that Stravinsky is taking here, 5/4 time. The actual idea starts here on the second beat and is essentially a 4/4 idea, right? But he just wants there to be a downbeat first, right? Boom, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, right? So that actually makes a lot of sense. Now, this is this is just really such a cool movement here. Okay, he says F detached, right? Almost like you would write détaché for sort of swift back and forth bowing for the strings. But what he really means is a kind of staccato here, right? He just really wants everything to be really disconnected, which you would think would be staccato. But really, he is setting up the winds to realize that they should match what's going on here with the pizzicato of the violins, which he could have almost written, quasi-pizzicato here, which some people have actually put into bass clarinet parts and bassoon parts. And in fact, there's a whole technique that bassoonists use to match pizzicato from the lower strings, which I've actually talked about in my Orchestration 102 course. You can actually almost hear the strings more powerfully here, and the flutes almost come across as a bit of icing, as well as the clarinets. That's the way that I hear it, and the way that most orchestras end up balancing this. And of course, they are answered once again, by this. Now notice that the tuba and the lower brass are kind of backing off. There's just one tuba that is doubling what's going on in the piccolo timpani, right? And then there's some support down here by the lower strings, all down bows, right? Once again, we just have some Stravinsky down bows, very strong down bows. But it actually, I think it's great the way that is scored, because it allows the timpani to really stand out, and all of these other elements that are at play here underline the sense of pitch of the timpani, rather than just really doubling them and kind of fattening them, right? But they just really make it sound much more timpani-ish than it actually might even be if it were just a straight timpani solo. And of course, the timpani is right away answered just by the winds doing something similar again. Now, here is like one of my favorite parts in the entire piece. We're going to be focusing right here, but I just want you to be able to see which instruments are playing what. Okay, if you want to describe something kind of sickly sweet in your music, this is a really good model to work from. You've got the oboe and the sopranino clarinet playing thirds here, and you've got the B-flat clarinet an octave below the D clarinet, right? So it just has this really squeezed sound to it. And if the players are putting in a little bit of vibrato, like if the oboist is putting in a little bit of vibrato, it just sounds even more sinister. Sometimes I hear the oboist kind of matching the non-vibrato of the clarinets, or just backing off on their vibrato a bit. But sometimes I hear them really playing it up, and the just the kind of dissonant qualities there are just even more underlined. I mean, it's not dissonant harmonically, but just it's dissonant aesthetically. And then that is kind of answered by an even higher oboe. So this is basically the same notes as this sopranino clarinet here, right? Which now becomes part of the harmony, right? And the third oboe takes the place of the first clarinet. It's the same basic gesture, note for note, but it has a different sound because it's just using different instruments. What I think is like the most standout thing here is the dynamic of mezzo piano. Now, at the time that I'm recording this, there is a Ravel challenge going on in the Facebook group and on Patreon. And I've been critical of some scores that sort of overuse mezzo piano, or kind of uses it as a baseline of, everything is mezzo piano, and then they kind of go from there louder or softer. But here, I think this just really shows how sinister mezzo piano can be. It is really a dull, pale place to put your music, and I think that Stravinsky is completely aware of that. He just really wants this to be dried out, pale, and colorless, and just wisping, almost just like these primitive people are playing on some strange ancient reed instruments that are like just almost jarringly non-expressive. And then the same thing here comes back, the same kind of idea with a triplet in the middle rather than this dotted rhythm with the original instruments. And then what I love right here is that they're answered. They're answered by flutes and alto flute, doing a similar gesture, but just, down a third. And their accompanying instruments are horns, not like high trumpet and English horn, kind of going back over this harmony in the middle. Yeah, so it suddenly has this wonderfully cool sound. It's just a lovely study in contrasts. And then that big kind of violent stomping gesture of the horns come in again, once again 5/4, for no other reason than that there be a downbeat, and then the 4/4 time just basically starts on the second beat once again. You can see that just in those 6 pages there was a huge variety of different scoring approaches. Please join me on Patreon to see the rest, all the way up to the concluding section, The Procession of the 300-Year-Old Man. Otherwise, I'll see you back here next month for another preview, this time of the final section of Part 1, the dancing out of the earth, and also a discussion of the many times that the Rite of Spring and its creator Stravinsky have been on screen.